Well, hello everybody. We might kick off. I can see that people are still streaming into the room, but people will pick it up as we go along. Hello everybody. My name is Eamon Waterford. I'm the CEO of the Committee for Sydney. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. I'm on Gadigal land, but I can see from the participants that you're likely on a very wide variety of different lands right now. Whether you're in Sydney or in regional New South Wales or Queensland or Victoria, we've got a really great cross-section of organisations. So I pay my respects to elders past and present who've had continual custodianship of this land for tens of thousands of years. I am so delighted to be having this conversation. This is a really, really interesting topic that has enormous relevance to Sydney, and we are extremely lucky to be joined by Tom Wright, who's the President and CEO of the Regional Planning Association of New York. Tom runs RPA. RPA is kind of like our sister organisation, but a big sister, much older sister, a sister who's been around for more than a century, and we are constantly jealous and appreciate the fantastic work they do. Tom was recently noted by the New York Times as one of the 7 people who'd made a positive difference to New York in the last year, along with an animal. And Tom, you'll have to remind me what type of animal was the 8th living being that was listed on that list by the New York Times. But Tom was specifically noted for his advocacy and contributions on the fight to implement congestion charging in New York. And that's why I've asked him to join us. What we're going to do today is I'm going to throw over to Tom in a second. Tom will talk through some of the background to RPA, the work that they've been doing and what the congestion charging program looks like. And then we'll have a Q&A session. For those of you who've joined online, you will see a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and you can ask questions into that. And when we get to the Q&A session, I will get to all of your questions. And I suspect that we will start with congestion charging, but I'm sure we will end with the political environment in America, because it's a hot topic right now, given that our steel and aluminium trade has just been impacted by tariffs. So it's something that's affecting Australia significantly. This session is also being recorded. You would have got a notification of that when you joined the meeting. What that means in practice is that we're going to put this up online. So if you enjoyed this session and some of your colleagues didn't get a chance to come along, we will be able to share a link to them to watch it at a later date. Tom, I'm wondering if you could just throw forward a slide or two, just because I want to do one more thing. That's me. That's the other thing I wanted to do, is to thank our Innovation Fund partners and our Global Pathways partner. These organisations support our research and events program, and we're grateful for their support every day, along with all of the Committee for Sydney's members. These organisations specifically support our work. I think that's all of the business to be done with before we jump into it. So, Tom, I'm going to throw to you. Welcome. Hello. How are you?
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much for that introduction. It was a coyote that was roaming Central Park that was also recognized by the Times. My daughters got a lot of amusement out of that one.
It's not bad, a coyote, I feel
Oh,
like,
no.
as a novelty, if nothing else.
Yes, absolutely. Although there are a lot of people and organizations who deserve credit for congestion pricing, so I felt a little bit embarrassed by that call out, but it was very nice of them.
Well, as I hope you're about to jump into, I suspect this is something that you've been working on for a very, very long time. So why don't you jump in, tell us a little bit about yourself, tell us a little bit about RPA and the work that you've been doing.
Sure. Thank you, Eamon, for this opportunity. This is actually my first presentation on this topic since congestion pricing went live barely over a month ago. And so it was quite a lot of fun. I want to thank my colleague Ian Akrish, who helped me put together this presentation. And I wanted to share kind of a little bit again of the history of how it came to pass, what the policy is, and talk about some of the early, and it's obviously very, very early, but the results are so candidly, stunningly positive that we feel we need to start talking about them. First, just to do a little level setting for everybody. And you can see my screen here, right, Eamon? It's all good?
Yes, we can. You're going great.
So Regional Plan Association, like the Committee for Sydney, is a private nonprofit civic organization. We have absolutely zero weight of law, but we've been around for just over 100 years now. And over that century, as an independent organization, we have done research, planning, and advocacy for long-range policies and investments that shape this entire tri-state metropolitan region. This is the metropolitan region around New York City and the 5 boroughs, but it includes parts all of Long Island, the lower Hudson Valley, southwestern Connecticut, and northern New Jersey. It's 3 states, 31 counties, some 782 towns and cities, of which 1 is New York City and 781 are not. And when you think about most of the planning in the United States, land use planning in particular, is really done at the municipal level and by jurisdictions. And of course, traffic, air pollution, water pollution, housing markets don't really respect political boundaries. And so RPA is the sole organization that has been thinking of this entire region as a single unit. And during that 100 years time, we've put out 4 major plans in 1928, 2028, 29, 68, 96, and 2017 when we produced our 4th regional plan. I actually worked as a junior staffer on the 96 plan, which laid out a series of recommendations for investing in mass transit, revitalizing the city and other things. And yes, we called for in that 96 plan, charging people to drive into Manhattan to pay for the investments. 21 years later, we doubled down on that recommendation in the 4th regional plan and pushed it again. And in 2019, we managed to get legislation finally approved, putting a congestion zone in place. It took then about 5 years for the planning and the regulatory review process to move forward so that the plan just went into effect in early January of this year. So also just to kind of give everybody a sense of the region that we're talking about, the tri-state metropolitan region has the greatest transit network in the United States by far, and really truly one of the great transit networks in the entire planet. We have 3 major commuter railroads: New Jersey Transit, Metro North, and the Long Island Railroad. The Metro North and Long Island Railroad systems are part of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the New York entity that also controls the subways and buses. And then Amtrak runs the entire Northeast Corridor and owns much of the right-of-way running through the spine right through it. And ridership on a typical weekday is over 700,000 trips. There are over 100,000 people commuting into the city on each of those commuter railroads and then back out again, and then many more trips being made to portions within the region. And then, of course, that's all on top of this extraordinary subway system, the New York City Transit Authority subway, which was built at the beginning of the last century. It's primarily a system to bring people in and out of Manhattan, in and out of the central business district. Not as good connections, say, between the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens directly. But it is one of the great marvels of the world. It runs 24/7. It never shuts down. It has on its major trunk lines express lines that allow people to bypass stations and really provide a kind of hybrid service that is extraordinary. And for $2.75, you can get anywhere across the city. So what we're building on top of is the system, but of course, it was really falling apart. As a kid in the 1970s, I can recall what it was like. And so we went through a period after World War II, and this is common to many metro regions around the world, a kind of disinvestment in that system while we were prioritizing the automobile and trying to build limited access highways and bridges and tunnels for cars. In the 1980s, really, we started a kind of rebirth of the New York City subway. And first, it was what we called state of good repair and bringing the system back so that the cars weren't breaking down and other things. But we didn't invest in new capacity or expansion of the system for another generation. And it really wasn't even until the project started around 2000 and soon after 9/11. And then a number of projects were begun under Mayor Bloomberg, Governor Spitzer, and then Cuomo, and others. And in the last 10 years, this is one of the things that I think New Yorkers don't even quite realize, is there are these 4 major projects that improved transit in the city. The first was the number 7 extension to Hudson Yards, the first extension of a subway system in 3 generations, perhaps. And it connected that subway line from Times Square out over to the Hudson Yards to start the development of that area. Soon after that, we opened up Moynihan Train Hall, a beautiful train hall across the street from the old Penn Station, which is the largest train station transit hub in North America. And Moynihan is serviced primarily for Amtrak, but also the Long Island Railroad, and creates a kind of quality space for people. And then the two really extraordinary ones, phase one of Second Avenue Subway. The Second Avenue Subway was a project that had been started and stopped multiple times over the last century. But finally, on New Year's Eve, I want to say 2017, it opened up and moving hundreds of thousands of people a day. And then just 2 years ago, East Side Access opened up, giving the Long Island Railroad commuters access to the East Midtown instead of where they used to go to Penn Station on the west side. The key thing about this is that any one of these projects would have been by itself the single largest thing to happen to mass transit from, let's say, 1950 to 2000. And all of them happened in just a 10-year period of time. And what this is that we're in New York, I would argue kind of still the beginning phase, or kind of the first decade or so of a generation of investment in mass transit. And if you take a step back and look at what else is on the drawing board, there's a project that RPA has championed called the Interborough Express, which is to take a surface freight rail line and convert it to passenger use. The London Overground is our inspiration here. That project is underway. Phase two of Second Avenue Subway, extending it up into East Harlem, is underway. In addition to East Side Access, the red line there is something we call Penn Access, which is to take the existing track that Amtrak uses into Penn Station and allow Metro North trains, which currently only go to Grand Central, to take it. Then we have a $10 billion overhaul of the Port Authority bus terminal designed by Foster and Partners, and the great granddaddy of them all, the Gateway Project, which is to build two new tracks under the Hudson River, essentially doubling capacity under the Hudson River, and kind of fixing the chokehold in the entire Boston to Washington Northeast corridor. So we're going through right now in New York an extraordinary period of investment in mass transit, but all of it, of course, relies on funding. And we did have, under the Biden administration, federal funding, but we need local funding to match it. And congestion pricing is really the linchpin to all of this. It is the key to creating stable revenue source that we can use going forward. So I'll kind of say, and just to, it's been in the news a great deal since it started. It's been in national news. Here I am giving a talk to folks in Australia. And so everybody's kind of watching, and we're paying a lot of attention to make sure we do it right. So let me explain the way the system worked, the highway system worked in New York prior to, and then what congestion pricing has done. And one of the things that I've come to realize in the last few years is that we were not a blank slate. Unlike London, which had a very complicated system. I believe when they turned their congestion zone on some 25 years ago, almost 25 years ago, there were over 150 ways that a car could enter the zone. In Manhattan, south of 60th Street, it's an island. There are only 18 ways to get in between the avenues and the bridges and tunnels. So it's quite easy to create a structure, on the one hand, to implement congestion pricing. But on the other hand, it was very complicated because we already had a series of tolled crossings, and all of them were kind of operated and owned by different entities. The Hudson River crossings, the George Washington Bridge, Lincoln Tunnel, and the Holland Tunnel, are all run by a bi-state public authority called the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. They charge a toll just to enter Manhattan, to cross from the west to the east. So it's a one-directional toll that is up to about $16 right now. The fares, I took kind of averages here because it depends whether you're paying with cash or Easy Pass, peak, off-peak, truck, car, etc. But these are kind of the typical two-way tolls if you're using Easy Pass for a car. Meanwhile, some of the other crossings, the Henry Hudson Bridge, the RFK Bridge, the Queens Midtown Tunnel, and the Hugh Carey Tunnel, those are tolled in both directions. So the toll is actually half the amount you see here. Those are the legacy investments built by Robert Moses, the great power broker, owned and operated by the MTA. And then all the other crossings, the 60th Street crossings and things like the Williamsburg, Manhattan, and Brooklyn bridges, are streets essentially run by New York City Department of Transportation, and we're all free. So one of the things that we had to deal with when we put the congestion zone in place in New York was that it wasn't, again, a kind of a blank slate. And instead we had different times of day with peak or off peak, one way versus two way versus free roads. And so one of the questions we really had, what we wanted to see was a kind of coordination of this. But it was a very complicated situation. By the way, this current way was about the worst way you could manage our streets. By having free crossings next to tolled ones, what you did was essentially incentivize people not to take the most direct or shortest route, but to take the cheapest route. So we've had for a long time in New York something we call toll shopping, where many of the drivers, say from South Brooklyn, will bypass the Hugh Carey Tunnel to go to the free crossings, causing worse local traffic congestion. There's nothing good for the economy when somebody drives out of their way, adds vehicle miles traveled to their trip simply to avoid a toll. Likewise, we have the Henry Hudson and the RFK crossings from the Bronx into Upper Manhattan. Many of the vehicles making those trips from Westchester or Connecticut were bypassing those highways to take the free Harlem River Bridge crossings, which are essentially on local roads, causing terrible traffic congestion and worsening our air quality. The South Bronx, by many measures, has the worst air quality and the highest childhood asthma rates in the entire nation. Not a coincidence. So the proposal that was put forward was essentially to create, originally it was going to be a $15 toll, and it was supposed to go into effect over the summer. But candidly, kind of the political support for this has always been a little bit shaky. And over the summer, Governor Hochul, who had control over this, in New York, many of these systems are really controlled by the state. And so the governor put a pause on it, essentially to wait until after the November elections, because there were contested congressional seats in Long Island and the Hudson Valley, and the Republicans were running against the tolls, and there was a concern that it would flip seats. So she paused it for several months, and when she brought it back in the fall, right after the election, she announced that they were going to start at a $9 toll instead of 15, but ratcheting up. In 3 years, it would go up to 12, and 3 years after that, up to 15. The other kind of compromise that was made was a recognition that some people were already paying, and what we wanted to do was reduce the differential between the free and the tolled crossings so that there would be less of an incentive for people to drive to do the toll shopping. So for the Lincoln Tunnel, Holland Tunnel, Queens Midtown Tunnel, and Hugh Carey Tunnel, there was a $3 credit given. So essentially the new toll is $6, not $9. So that brings us to kind of what the current system looks like today. And this shows you in two ways what, for a round trip, what a driver would be paying on each of these. It's still quite a bit more expensive to take the Hugh Carey Tunnel than the Brooklyn Bridge. But we've managed to kind of reduce that differential somewhat. The Lincoln Tunnel and the Holland Tunnel are now less expensive than the George Washington Bridge. And one of the concerns we have is that some people would, who currently drive over the GW and would come down, might go to the Lincoln Tunnel, causing worse traffic congestion there. But on the other hand, there are some people making trips through the Lincoln Tunnel whose destination is not in the zone, who now have an incentive essentially to drive up New Jersey into the area. So this is kind of what we currently have in place. It's through electronic gantries collecting it, so it's a contactless system. If you have Easy Pass, they read your Easy Pass transponder on your dashboard or your windshield. If you don't, they take a photograph of your license plate and send you the bill. One of the concerns we have, obviously, is that there's an incentive for people to cheat the system, and we're going to be monitoring that very carefully going forward. But the simple fact is, the goal with congestion pricing was both to raise revenue and to reduce traffic congestion. And I guess I should back up, anticipating a question of how did you do it? The real driver around this was less around the traffic relief and more about the funding for the mass transit system. In 2017, New York suffered what Governor Cuomo at the time called the summer of hell. And it just seemed like the system was breaking down on a regular basis because of deferred maintenance. Things had really gotten worse, and people were angry and upset. And so business groups, my organization, environmental organizations, transit organizations, many different groups with a wide range of priorities all found themselves going up to Albany and lobbying legislators, arguing that we needed to create this system to generate the revenues to fix the transit. But of course, also the idea behind congestion pricing is that by pricing the road, if you can just reduce by a small amount the number of vehicles within the enclosed system in Manhattan south of 60th Street, the theory was that you could improve travel times because it's each additional vehicle in that closed system creates more traffic than the prior one. And so if you can just reduce by, 5 to 10% the number of vehicles, the thinking was, we would start to see system-wide benefits in terms of reduced traffic congestion. And this is where there was an enormous amount of modeling. Essentially, I'll just say, the law was passed in 2019. The first thing the MTA had to do was they knew they needed federal approval. So they sent a report down to Washington to the US Department of Transportation and said, which kind of studies should we do? And candidly, the Trump administration's Department of Transportation never returned the mail. And so for 2 years, nothing happened because they simply refused to give guidance to the MTA about what they needed to do. In 2001, the Biden administration came in. The former city DOT commissioner, Polly Trottenberg, became the number 2 person at the Department of Transportation, and the wheels started rolling. And they did an environmental review, making estimates of what would happen, looking at a number of different scenarios, and then putting this one in place. So where are we today, and what does the system look like? First, just to give you a sense of the volumes, about 17% of the vehicles are coming across the Hudson River from New Jersey. Another 17% come down the west side and 27% come down the east side and 16% from Queens and Brooklyn. One of the important things I'll say on this map, you see a kind of white outline of Manhattan. That is actually what we called an exclusion zone. The Albany, when they passed the bill, they said that if somebody wanted to drive around Manhattan without going into any of the neighborhoods, they shouldn't have to pay the zone, making the system much more complicated, frankly. But they kind of created this exclusion zone. So it's possible to cross a bridge and get right on what we call the FDR on the east side or the west side highway on the west side and drive out of the zone without paying the toll. Here's what we're seeing, and what I'm going to share now are very early analyses. It would be much better to wait more months, but since we're being asked about it now, the MTA and other organizations have been working to try and analyze just what's happening. The first one is that the number of vehicles has dropped slightly. We're comparing this to about 583 vehicles entered the roadway on average a year ago in January of 2024. And looking through the first few weeks of January 2025, what you see is that essentially 490,000 vehicles entered the zone, another 63,000 stayed on the excluded roadways, but all told, that was still 553,000, about 30,000 less than the historical average. That's the shocking thing for me, frankly, is how close that is to what we had anticipated, what the modeling predicted. The other interesting thing is just that taking 30,000 vehicles out of almost 600,000 vehicles on the roadways overall has had a measurable impact on the way the system works. The other thing that we've noticed is that this is kind of entries into the zone by time of day. And there's a peak off-peak differential. After 9 p.m. at night and before 5 a.m. in the morning, the $9 toll is only $2.25. It's a 75% reduction. Well, what we're seeing here, and so you see in the kind of the gray line are taxis and for-hire vehicles, which have not really changed their behavior much as a result of this system at all. But passenger vehicles entering the zone, what you see is people kind of rushing to get in just before 5 a.m. or rushing to come in just after 9 p.m. And of course, this is a good thing. This is exactly what we want, because what we wanted to do was incentivize people with those off-peak discounts to travel in the, late at night when there's less traffic. And that allows the entire system to operate more efficiently and better. I won't spend too much time on this, but the MTA has kind of done analyses of each of the crossings into the central business district, the Lincoln and Holland tunnels from New Jersey, the bridges from Brooklyn and Queens, etc. And what we've seen is some very, very impressive time savings. This is, the Holland Tunnel in particular. I can't imagine this will stay this high. But in those first few weeks of January, it really took about half the amount of time to travel through the Holland Tunnel into Manhattan that it had prior to congestion pricing. That's a very significant drop. Even the 10 and 30% reductions that we saw, say on the Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Williamsburg bridges, are ones that we were very, very happy with. You'll see some outliers on this, the red areas. Those are essentially attributable to either construction or accidents, kind of creating outliers. They've also done analyses on the cross streets, eastbound and westbound, the major avenues that go across Manhattan. Here, there's more of a differential. Again, some of this may be due to construction or even weather. But in general, what we're seeing are significant travel time savings. Then we looked at the avenues that cross, the ways that you can get into southern Manhattan from the north, First Avenue, Second Avenue, etc. Here, the travel time savings are a little bit lower, but still mostly somewhat positive. So another question people has, what is this going to do to transit ridership? Subway ridership is up modestly, but it's really hard to attribute this to congestion pricing. Essentially, what the MTA has reported is that on the average weekday in January of 2025, there were about 7.3% more riders than there had been in January a year before, 12.2% more than on the weekends. The thing to keep in mind with this that we want to point out is that we're still in a post-COVID recovery. Ridership on the subways is still below what it was prior to COVID and has been increasing naturally every year on its own. In fact, if you took, say, the most recent December from the December a year before, ridership had gone up between 4 and 6% on most of the subway lines during that period of time. So what we saw January to January was, yes, there's an increase in ridership, but maybe if you think that the ridership would have gone up, say, 5% all by itself, what we're really talking about is more like a 2% ridership. All that makes sense when you keep in mind that 90% of the people accessing Midtown Manhattan prior to congestion pricing were already taking mass transit, and only 10% were driving in a vehicle. So it's just kind of the law of numbers. If even half of the people in a vehicle had switched to mass transit, that would be a 50% reduction in vehicles, but only a 5% increase in mass transit ridership. So a 2.3% increase in ridership on a typical weekday to us sounds like actually robust growth, and fortunately we have capacity for it. The bigger impact has really been on the bus system, where bus speeds have dramatically improved due to a lack of congestion on the roads. So the MTA took a couple typical bus routes through the Lincoln Tunnel, Midtown Tunnel, Queensboro Tunnel, etc. The median trip time has dropped quite a bit, but the P90 is the big number I would encourage you to look at. That is the 90th percentile running time for that route, which is to say, part of the problem with buses in particular is when you get stuck in traffic, a trip that's supposed to take 30 minutes can take 60. So the 90th percentile is a bad trip. And what we're seeing is the biggest improvements are in reducing those numbers. In other words, taking a bus has become much more reliable. You don't have to account for the significant delays that you might have had to prior to this, which is really, really astounding. And not surprisingly, bus ridership is up much more than subway ridership. In fact, weekend growth on express routes is up over 20% just in January. And so we're really excited by these kinds of bumps in bus ridership. Again, we'd kind of hoped for them, but had been careful not to make any promises. I'll just wrap up with a few other statistics. Mass transit ridership is up in specific areas. Some of the stops have seen significant ridership increases. One of the things that's especially gratifying to me, Broadway attendance is up. And yes, the Broadway theater owners generally were opposed to congestion pricing because they thought that the $9 surcharge would dissuade people from coming to their shows on weekends. We made the argument that a family driving in is already going to be paying $50 to $100 for parking, probably $50 to $100 per person for lunch, and $100 to $200 for a ticket. A $9 charge spread across the entire vehicle didn't seem like a big deal to us. And in fact, what's happening is that now that people are hearing that they can drive in and out without so much traffic, Broadway is benefiting from this, which is very, very exciting. Similarly, we're seeing foot traffic increase within the traffic relief zone. We've started to, the business improvement districts, which track this, are seeing, have seen about 1.5 million more people on a typical day within the zone than a year ago, which is just terrific. And then I'm just still going through these, but this is one of the most exciting and least expected of them. Crashes are down dramatically, 50%. This is showing, now one of the things, we went all the way back to 2020, but of course during the pandemic, when things shut down, crashes dropped dramatically and had been increasing up to about 200 in 2024. This is in January of that month. Less than half of that in January of 2025. So congestion pricing is literally going to save lives and improve public safety, which is really, really exciting. Frankly, we're a little surprised by this because if cars are driving faster, we were worried that we might see a trend in the opposite direction. But so far, this seems to be holding. So finally, just, what we're seeing is that voters and through surveys, people are now supporting it. And a policy which has always been underwater. I mean, how many people, when you poll them, if you say, do you want to pay more for something that's currently free, it's not something that people usually like. But by a 2-to-1 margin, people are agreeing that congestion pricing has reduced traffic. Manhattan voters in particular are all strong supporters, and regular commuters in particular say that things are much better. So many of them are saying it's led to faster commutes. 3 and 4 drivers now say that they want to see it going, and many of them say that President Trump should leave it in place, because you might have heard this, but he has said that he wants to take it away. So right now we're kind of seeing much more support for congestion pricing going up, and this is my last slide just to kind of summarize it. Bus ridership is up, subway ridership is up, regional rail ridership, foot traffic, vehicle traffic down, faster driving times, crashes down, Broadway attendance and sales are up, and support and favorability is up. So the system is really working extraordinarily well. Thanks, Eamon.
I'm really disappointed there's no bad news. I mean, that's so fantastic, Tom. I mean, great and really, really comprehensive detail on the whole program. It's really, really great to have that. So thank you. First and foremost, I should say thank you for your contributions. Folks online, there is a Q&A button if you want to ask questions. We've already got a couple coming in, but please do put your questions in there, because we'll have probably about 15 to 20 minutes for plenty of questions to get through. Tom, one I want to start with, we obviously follow the history of urban policy in New York quite intensely. And a lot of that probably has to do with the power broker and the sort of large looming role that Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs play in kind of urbanism. But it sounds like, so much of what you're talking about has its basis in decisions that were made 80, 90 years ago, and that's sort of playing through. How confident are you that you are able to sort of break from those historical tendencies, and you expect to see this change the way that New Yorkers interface with their city?
Yeah, no, I think that's first of all, should I take off screen share, or are we good the way we are?
Yeah, why don't you take off screen share? Yeah, okay. So we can see our faces. That's
at least on my screen. Then we're not tiny little.
There we go.
There we go. No, that's a really good point, and it's one that I tried to make many times with Governor Hochul, because I wanted her to understand what an historic figure we see her as. There's a wonderful new book out called Movement by Nicole Gelinas, a reporter in New York, that does about 100 years worth of kind of the transportation system of New York City. Her opening thesis in many ways is that Robert Moses gets vilified for having built all these highways and the auto-centric city and region. And as she puts it, he was a creature, not the creator of the times.
Mm.
And that, in fact, in the 1930s and 40s, when he was building out these highway systems, that was the general consensus of everybody. And in fact, she says, if you really want to see where the ideas came from, look at the 1929 RPA regional plan, because we laid out a bunch of the highways that Moses was building. We famously had a break with him over whether a bridge or a tunnel should connect Brooklyn to the tip of Lower Manhattan. But the point was that the consensus, the overwhelming consensus of business, of civic leaders, of intellectuals, architects, you name it, planners, was that the future was auto-oriented and that what we needed to do was invest in the infrastructure for the automobile. We needed to build parking decks. We needed to build limited access highways. And Robert Moses, of course, wanted to build highways right through Greenwich Village and Soho and other parts of Manhattan. And Jane Jacobs and other activists came up and opposed him and taught us to do it a different way. But they didn't have the ability to kind of rescue the subway system. Under their watch, while they were fighting against the Westway project and fighting against the Lower Manhattan Expressway, the New York City subways were still falling apart. And so again, in the larger history, we managed to invest in and bring the subway back from falling apart. But it really still wasn't, there wasn't a kind of a basic resetting of priority to say the future is around people on their feet, on their bikes, and in mass transit, and it's not around automobiles. The Bloomberg administration was, we really are in New York still living in the world that Michael Bloomberg and his team put together for us, and we benefit from it. Because many of these policies, I should say that when we proposed this in 1996, it was 11 years later that Michael Bloomberg became the first elected official in New York, the first mayor or governor to endorse the concept. And he proposed it as part of his Plan NYC sustainable vision for New York and tried to get it through Albany back then. And we were 3 votes short of soon to be indicted and convicted corrupt legislators from getting this approved almost 20 years ago. So it is that kind of a tectonic, a kind of paradigm shift in terms of recognizing the future. Let me say one more thing just to give a sense of how profound this is. Basically, since we built out the regional highway network in the early 1970s, the number of automobiles and vehicles that enter Manhattan south of 60th Street has not changed, and it's physically limited. It has actually declined somewhat from 2000 to 2020. More recently, we saw, of course, the for-hire vehicles come in and many more of those vehicles, but they pushed out private vehicles and deliveries have come up and pushed out taxis and things because there's just no more space for that. And when you think about, if New York is going to add, and New York over that period of time added almost 1 million jobs. Now, all those jobs, everyone working in one of those jobs, how did they get to work? They either walked or they biked or they took mass transit because nobody else was driving. And if you think for another 20, 25 years out and another 1 million jobs coming to New York, none of them will be by people driving. And so we have to be investing in this system and expanding it. And that's what this policy underpins.
Fascinating. We're getting some really great questions in. So I'm going to jump to questions from the audience and I'm going to combine a question from Annie Matan and a question from Sam Gray. Where the money goes. So the money collected from the tolls, is it put into a big pot or is it hypothecated to specific projects? And then the second aspect to that is how quickly can that money get out the door in order to invest in new alternatives to driving to further get support and endorsement from residents?
Excellent questions. As I said, in 2017, we had this summer of hell. And so as part of that, and took us 2 years to get this policy in place. And what the MTA did during that time was it created a 5-year capital plan, actually to run from 2021 through 2025, that would fund $60 billion of capital investments. And when they put together the funding package for that capital plan, they identified, here's how much money we can get out of our existing pots of money. Here's how much we can get from the federal government. And they had a $15 billion hole. So the proposal was to create a congestion charge that could generate enough money to bond out for the $15 billion. So The toll is expected, and the MTA has not released numbers yet. I expect them any day now, candidly. But the goal here is to generate north of $1 billion a year that the MTA will purchase, will issue bonds, and then get the money up front in a lump sum, essentially, to invest quickly in those systems. But there is a concern. I mean, in London, they improved the bus system before putting the policy in place. And I wish that we had been able to do something like that here too, because putting that money to work effectively and quickly is going to be a challenge for the MTA. I mean, spending $15 billion is not easy. They have an excellent capital plan. They have been improving their process for it, but it is not a smooth process.
That comes to another interesting element of this from an anonymous questioner. The equity element of this. I mean, one of the big challenges in Sydney is tolling overwhelmingly impacts those least able to afford it because they have further to drive, because they live in more affordable housing further away from where the jobs are. How does the equity element of this impact for those that don't have public transport alternatives as and have to drive?
And that was a huge part of the debate around congestion pricing, was essentially people arguing this is a regressive tax. You know, the billionaire in his being driven in by his chauffeur is paying the same toll that the person barely hanging on is. As part of the federal assessment, the environmental assessment that the MTA had to do, they really dug into who drives in, what do they make, why are they driving in, what is the purpose of the trip, and all this. And what we realized was, while everybody might be paying the same amount, if you look at the people who drive in, it's overwhelmingly wealthy people. The incomes of people who drive in is roughly double the incomes of people who take mass transit. And very, very few people of low incomes and means are actually driving it. And when I say very, very low, less than 1% make less than $55,000 a year. So what the MTA did was they said, the same way on our subways, we have something called fair fares, which is to say, if you rely on the subway and you need to use it, but the expense is a hardship for you, you can apply through a program to essentially pay a half fare on the subway system. The MTA said for people who can prove that their income is under a certain amount, after a certain number of trips per month, they will only have to pay half the amount. We're really concerned about the opportunity for abuse of this, that people will start to cheat on that side of it. So it's going to be needing a lot of monitoring. But the simple truth is that, you know, the vast majority of low-income New Yorkers rely on the mass transit system. And so by charging people who drive and using that money to invest in the transit system, we think that this is a progressive policy and not a regressive one. But that was one of the central debates around this whole thing.
Fascinating. That's probably a much lower proportion than those that are driving. I mean, the geography of the CBD of Sydney is a much smaller area than, I guess, lower than 60th Street in New York. And so it wouldn't be a very large number of people on low incomes driving into that area for the end of their trip. But one thing that there's a question here is around people who are going through Manhattan to get elsewhere. So Peter Warrington has asked, are there any proposals for cross-city road tunnels that just basically bypass Manhattan, go underneath?
Robert Moses tried that.
Right.
So the answer is no. I mean, there are no proposals for extending or expanding highways really around New York City right now. And none of us think that that would be a wise use of our limited resources. What we have are these, you know, there's a long list of capital projects to improve mass transit. And by the way, I should have said, of the $60 billion in the MTA's 5-year capital plan, 80% of that is not expansion projects, but simply state of good repair. It's replacing aging railway cars, it's improving stations, adding accessibility to stations, it's replacing power systems and brakes, and improving the signals. So we're still playing catch up for decades of underinvestment in our system.
A question from Russell King. Are the system-wide benefits outside of the congestion relief zone expected to be significant from this, or is there more that's needed to be done to deal with those system-wide issues beyond the congestion zone?
Yeah. So we don't have data. First off, those time savings I talked about were only for like the portion of while you were in the tunnel or on the bridge. But of course, the trip by itself is actually a much longer one. And what we're seeing in general is that the benefits extend, while the 15-minute trip under the Holland Tunnel may now be a 5-minute trip, but even better, the 30-minute trip from the approach all the way is now, say, a 10-minute trip, and that's even better. What we
Mm,
don't yet know is what about the trips that never come into the zone? The trips in downtown Brooklyn, the trips in the South Bronx, the trips in northeastern New Jersey, and we're going to be collecting data around that. There is the potential for there to be some kind of hotspots where traffic congestion could potentially get worse. In particular,
mm,
people who used to drive through the city if with their destinations on either end of it now have an incentive to go around. We actually want to keep them out of the city, but if that puts them through, say, the South Bronx, which has air quality concerns, that could be a bad thing. And in particular, we're monitoring the George Washington Bridge and the highway called the Cross Bronx Expressway. The MTA has already dedicated tens of millions of dollars towards mitigation efforts to try and improve air quality and reduce traffic congestion in those areas. They're going to be replacing diesel trucks with electric vehicles. They're going to be improving signals and other things. So we're going to be doing things to try and mitigate any negative impacts in localized areas because we do recognize that that could potentially happen. But this is one of the areas we have to study. I got to say, one of the other things is one of the hopes I had was that that kind of alphabet soup of different entities that control the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the New Jersey Turnpike Authority, the New York State Thruway Authority, the MTA and Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, all controlling a bit of the system. I would like to see them be more coordinated. I don't think
mm.
that some should pull in two directions and some in one direction. And I'd like them to all have the same peak off-peak hours. I know that sounds simple, but we don't have it today. So we're hoping to see some better regional coordination between these entities as a result of this.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be just a simple quality of life improvement that residents would, they're not living their lives by which entity they want to use, for which bridge. Oh, I love using the
Right,
tri-state,
right. They don't care.
those.
Oh, well, at least I'm paying the MTA, not that Port Authority. I really care about that. Nobody knows who they're paying. They just know they're paying.
Right. You mentioned air quality. Another question: is there pre and post tracking of air quality in
Yes.
these areas, so you'll be able to estimate the impact on public health as a result of these
Yes.
changes?
Yes, as part of the environmental assessment, this was one of the controversial things. And we're in a strange situation in the United States that a policy like this, which is so overwhelmingly positive environmentally, still took 5 years of study and was subject to lawsuits to kill it on environmental grounds, claiming that it hadn't been studied enough and other things. Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey is still trying to undo the policy, claiming that he likes congestion pricing, but he doesn't like this iteration of it and trying to sue on that. But those studies had to do very, very detailed traffic, air quality, particulate matters, and other studies. And so there is a baseline of data that will be compared against. Now, of course, a rainy day, suddenly the data is completely different from one. So we're going to need to wait longer to get more data to make announcements about it. But I would say that those of us working on this feel like those metrics I showed about reduced travel times and reduced traffic congestion, that is going to translate into significant air quality improvements
Mm,
overall. And
mm,
again, I think what we have to be careful about is that there could potentially be some hotspots that need mitigation. But we know that overall, this is going to be very, very dramatic in terms of improvements to air quality.
yeah,
As an asthmatic myself, I'm really excited to see we've
yeah.
been working with some of the hospitals to try and track childhood asthma rates
Huh.
because we anticipate they may be falling.
Fantastic. I want to turn to the politics as an apolitical organization, but I want to talk
Sure.
about, you mentioned Broadway as a group that was Broadway as a group that were initially
Yeah.
resistant and now are seeing some benefits from it. Can you Jack Herbert's asked a question around the broader stakeholder sentiment? Were there particular groups that you found were expected or unexpected supporters, opposers, and why?
Well, so first off, again, I would say it was a very broad coalition pushing this. RPA is the regional planners, the New York City Partnership, which represents large business, the finance sector, and the big businesses. The Riders Alliance, which are the scrappy strap hangers advocates, the Environmental Defense Fund, Natural Resources Defense Council, and League of Conservation Voters. So you had a very wide range of groups, and that was really important. And we had to be effective. And I'll say one of the really wonderful things about New York is that we have a civic ecosystem that is very robust, very well developed. We have local philanthropies that underwrite this kind of activity. And that was really exciting that we had, and frankly, the leadership of the MTA, Jano Lieber, the CEO of the MTA, the moment he got in that job, he started meeting regularly with advocates to share ideas and thoughts. And we didn't always agree on things, but there was an open dialogue that really created a very, very strong partnership for this. I'll say there were two, surprise characters. One, I went to present this a couple of years ago to the Broadway Theater Owners Group, and I was shocked at the level of opposition I got. They were, this is going to kill us. This is going to destroy us. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. Again, what it costs to come to your shows, this $9 fee is nothing. And traffic is what's keeping people away. And by the way, you guys are very good communicators and you have very large advertising budgets. Instead of wringing your hands about this, why don't you start an advertising campaign that says, come to a show, you're not going to get stuck in traffic for 3 hours on your way home in the night, and stuff. They were late to the table, and we'll see. I mean, candidly, I don't even know yet if they've changed their position.
Interesting.
But here's the group, the supporters that nobody expected were the for-hire vehicle companies, Uber in particular. And they wanted to see this. And what they said is, well, we think that, our business is moving people around. And if the streets don't work, everybody's dead. And here's one other thing I should have said, in addition to the zone charge, if you take a taxi ride, you now pay a little bit more than $1 fee into the zone as part of that trip. And if you take an Uber or Lyft or for-hire vehicle, you pay a little over $2 into the kitty to pay for that trip. I rode a for-hire vehicle last week trip, and I paid my $2 fee into it. My trip probably took 10, 15 minutes less than it would have before, probably saving me about $10 off the fare.
Right.
So I could put money into the MTA and still come out net saving money. And so it was really interesting, but the for-hire vehicle companies were strong supporters of this policy, and that was unexpected, but very, very welcome.
Yeah, fascinating. Hey, we're getting close to time, so I am. I'm afraid there's a couple of questions that we're just not going to get to, but gosh, there's so much more we could talk about. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. It's after hours for you there. So although City That Never Sleeps, you're obligated by your brand to stick around and chat to us. But thank you on behalf of the Committee for Sydney, on behalf of the people that were able to join us. Thank you for your time and thank you for your advocacy. It's such a great project. Well done.
I hope that Sydney will consider this kind of policy. I'd love to come and advocate for it in person. It is working in New York, and I wish you all the best luck in trying to advocate for it there, because it won't be the same. Of course, you have to tailor it to your city, but it is working so phenomenally well in New York right now. Right. I hope that this is a lesson other cities can take.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody, for joining. As I said, we've recorded it, so we'll share a link with you to share with your colleagues. Have a great day. See you all.